Postmodern Condition by Jean-François Lyotard. 14. Legitimation by Paralogy. Let us say at this point that the facts we have presented concerning the problem of the legitimation of knowledge today are sufficient for our purposes. We no longer have recourse to the grand narratives. We can resort neither to the dialectic of spirit nor even to the emancipation of humanity as a validation for postmodern scientific discourse. But as we have just seen, the little narrative remains the quintessential form of imaginative invention, most particularly in science. In addition, the principle of consensus as a criterion of validation seems to be inadequate. It has two formulations. In the first, consensus is an agreement between men, defined as knowing intellects and free wills, and is obtained through dialogue. This is the form elaborated by Habermas, but its conception is based on the validity of the narrative of emancipation. In the second, consensus is a component of the system, which manipulates it in order to maintain and improve its performance. It is the object of administrative procedures, in Luhmann's sense. In this case, its only validity is as an instrument to be used toward achieving the real goal, which is what legitimates the system power. The problem is therefore to determine whether it is possible to have a form of legitimation based solely on paralogy. Paralogy must be distinguished from innovation. The latter is under the command of the system, or at least used by it to improve its efficiency. The former is a move, the importance of which is often not recognized until later, played in the pragmatics of knowledge. The fact that it is in reality frequently, but not necessarily. The case that one is transformed into the other presents no difficulties for the hypothesis. Returning to the description of scientific pragmatics, it is now dissension that must be emphasized. Consensus is a horizon that is never reached. Research that takes place under the aegis of a paradigm tends to stabilize. It is like the exploitation of a technological, economic, or artistic idea. It cannot be discounted. But what is striking is that someone always comes along to disturb the order of reason. It is necessary to posit the existence of a power that destabilizes the capacity for explanation, manifested in the promulgation of new norms for understanding, or, if one prefers, in a proposal to establish new rules, circumscribing a new field of research for the language of science. This, in the context of scientific discussion, is the same process Tom calls morphogenesis. It is not without rules, but it is always locally determined. Applied to scientific discussion and placed in a temporal framework, this property implies that discoveries are unpredictable. In terms of the idea of transparency, it is a factor that generates blind spots and defers consensus. This summary makes it easy to see that systems theory and the kind of legitimation it proposes have no scientific basis whatsoever. Science itself does not function according to this theory's paradigm of the system, and contemporary science excludes the possibility of using such a paradigm to describe society. In this context, let us examine two important points in Luhmann's argument. On the one hand, the system can only function by reducing complexity, and on the other, it must induce the adaptation of individual aspirations to its own ends. The reduction in complexity is required to maintain the system's power capability. If all messages could circulate freely among all individuals, the quantity of the information that would have to be taken into account before making the correct choice would delay decisions considerably, thereby lowering performativity. Speed, in effect, is a power component of the system. The objection will be made that these molecular opinions must indeed be taken into account if the risk of serious disturbances is to be avoided. Luhmann replies, and this is the second point, that it is possible to guide individual aspirations through a process of quasi-apprenticeship, free of all disturbance, in order to make them compatible with the system's decisions. The decisions do not have to respect individuals' aspirations. The aspirations have to aspire to the decisions, or at least to their effects. Administrative procedures should make individuals want what the system needs in order to perform well. It is easy to see what role telematics technology could play in this. It cannot be denied that there is persuasive force in the idea that context control and domination are inherently better than their absence. The performativity criterion has its advantages. It excludes in principle adherence to a metaphysical discourse. It requires the renunciation of fables. It demands clear minds and cold wills. It replaces the definition of essences with the calculation of interactions. It makes the players assume responsibility not only for the statements they propose, but also for the rules to which they submit those statements in order to render them acceptable. It brings the pragmatic functions of knowledge clearly to light, to the extent that they seem to relate to the criterion of efficiency, the pragmatics of argumentation, of the production of proof, of the transmission of learning, and of the apprenticeship of the imagination. It also contributes to elevating all language games to self-knowledge, even those not within the realm of canonical knowledge. It tends to jolt everyday discourse into a kind of meta-discourse. Ordinary statements are now displaying a propensity for self-citation, and the various pragmatic posts are tending to make an indirect connection even to current messages concerning them. Finally, it suggests that the problems of internal communication experienced by the scientific community in the course of its work, of dismantling and remounting its languages, are comparable in nature to the problems experienced by the social collectivity. When, deprived of its narrative culture, it must re-examine its own internal communication, and in the process question the nature of the legitimacy of the decisions made in its name. At risk of scandalizing the reader, I would also say that the system can count severity among its advantages. Within the framework of the power criterion, a request gains nothing in legitimacy by virtue of being based on the hardship of an unmet need. Rights do not flow from hardship, but from the fact that the alleviation of hardship improves the system's performance. The needs of the most underprivileged should not be used as a system regulator, as a matter of principle. Since the means of satisfying them is already known, their actual satisfaction will not improve the system's performance, but only increase its expenditures. The only counterindication is that not satisfying them can destabilize the whole. It is against the nature of force to be ruled by weakness, but it is in its nature to induce new requests meant to lead to a redefinition of the norms of life. In this sense, the system seems to be a vanguard machine dragging humanity after it, dehumanizing it, in order to rehumanize it at a different level of normative capacity. The technocrats declare that they cannot trust what society designates as its needs. They know that society cannot know its own needs, since they are not variables independent of the new technologies. Such is the arrogance of the decision makers, and their blindness. What their arrogance means is that they identify themselves with a social system conceived as a totality, in quest of its most performative unity possible. If we look at the pragmatics of science, we learn that such an identification is impossible. In principle, no scientist embodies knowledge, or neglects the needs of a research project, or the aspirations of a researcher, on the pretext that they do not add to the performance of science as a whole. The response a researcher usually makes to a request is, "We'll have to see, tell me your story." In principle, they do not prejudge that a case has already been closed, or that the power of science will suffer if it is reopened. In fact, the opposite is true. Of course, it does not always happen like this in reality. Countless scientists have seen their movie ignored or repressed, sometimes for decades, because it too abruptly destabilized the accepted positions, not only in the university and scientific hierarchy, but also in the problematic. The stronger the move, the more likely it is to be denied the minimum consensus, precisely because it changes the rules of the game upon which consensus had been based. But when the institution of knowledge functions in this manner, it is acting like an ordinary power center whose behavior is governed by a principle of homeostasis. Such behavior is terrorist, as is the behavior of the system described by Luhmann. By terror, I mean the efficiency gained by eliminating or threatening to eliminate a player from the language game one shares with them. They are silenced or consent, not because they have been refuted, but because their ability to participate has been threatened. The decision-maker's arrogance, which in principle has no equivalent in the sciences, consists in the exercise of terror. It says, "Adapt your aspirations to our ends, or else." Even permissiveness toward the various games is made conditional on performativity. The redefinition of the norms of life consists in enhancing the system's competence for power. That this is the case is particularly evident in the introduction of telematics technology. The technocrats see in telematics a promise of liberalization and enrichment in the interactions between interlocutors. But what makes this process attractive for them is that it will result in new tensions in the system, and these will lead to an improvement in its performativity. To the extent that science is differential, its pragmatics provides the anti-model of a stable system. A statement is deemed worth retaining the moment it marks a difference from what is already known, and after an argument and proof in support of it has been found. Science is a model of an open system in which a statement becomes relevant if it generates ideas. That is, if it generates other statements and other game rules. Science possesses no general meta-language in which all other languages can be transcribed and evaluated. This is what prevents its identification with the system and, all things considered, with terror. If the division between decision makers and executors exists in the scientific community, and it does, it is a fact of the socio-economic system and not of the pragmatics of science itself. It is, in fact, one of the major obstacles to the imaginative development of knowledge. The general question of legitimation becomes, what is the relationship between the anti-model of the pragmatics of science and society? Is it applicable to the vast clouds of language material constituting a society? Or is it limited to the game of learning? And if so, what role does it play with respect to the social bond? Is it an impossible ideal of an open community? Is it an essential component for the subset of decision makers who force on society the performance criterion they reject for themselves? Or conversely, is it a refusal to cooperate with the authorities, a move in the direction of counterculture, with the attendant risk that all possibility for research will be foreclosed due to lack of funding? From the beginning of this study, I have emphasized the differences, not only formal but also pragmatic, between the various language games, especially between denotative or knowledge games and prescriptive or action games. The pragmatics of science is centered on denotative utterances, which are the foundation upon which it builds institutions of learning. Institutes, centers, universities, etc. But its postmodern development brings a decisive fact to the fore. Even discussions of denotative statements need to have rules. Rules are not denotative, but prescriptive utterances, which we are better off calling meta-prescriptive utterances to avoid confusion. They prescribe what the moves of language games must be in order to be admissible. The function of the differential or imaginative or paralogical activity of the current pragmatics of science is to point out these meta-prescriptives, science's presuppositions, and to petition the players to accept different ones. The only legitimation that can make this kind of request admissible is that it will generate ideas, in other words, new statements. Social pragmatics does not have the simplicity of scientific pragmatics. It is a monster, formed by the interweaving of various networks of heteromorphous classes of utterances: denotative, prescriptive, performative, technical, evaluative, etc. There's no reason to think that it would be possible to determine meta-prescriptives common to all of these language games, or that a revisable consensus, like the one in force at a given moment in the scientific community, could embrace the totality of meta-prescriptions regulating the totality of statements circulating in the social collectivity. As a matter of fact, the contemporary decline of narratives of legitimation, be they traditional or modern, the emancipation of humanity, the realization of the idea, is tied to the abandonment of this belief. It is its absence for which the ideology of the system, with its pretensions to totality, tries to compensate, and which it expresses in the cynicism of its criterion of performance. For this reason, it seems neither possible nor even prudent to follow Habermas in orienting our treatment of the problem of legitimation in the direction of a search for universal consensus through what he calls discourse, in other words, a dialogue of argumentation. For this reason, it seems neither possible nor even prudent to follow Habermas in orienting our treatment of the problem of legitimation in the direction of a search for universal consensus through what he calls discourse, in other words, a dialogue of argumentation. This would be to make two assumptions. The first is that it is possible for all speakers to come to agreement on which rules or meta-prescriptions are universally valid for language games, when it is clear that language games are heteromorphous, subject to heterogeneous sets of pragmatic rules. The second assumption is that the goal of dialogue is consensus. But as I have shown in the analysis of the pragmatics of science, consensus is only a particular state of discussion, not its end. Its end, on the contrary, is paralogy. This double observation destroys a belief that still underlies Habermas's research, namely, that humanity as a collective subject seeks its common emancipation through the regularization of the moves permitted in all language games, and that the legitimacy of any statement resides in its contributing to that emancipation. It is easy to see what function this recourse plays in Habermas's argument against Luhmann. Discourse is his ultimate weapon against the theory of the stable system. The cause is good, but the argument is not. Consensus has become an outmoded and suspect value. But justice as a value is neither outmoded nor suspect. We must thus arrive at an idea and practice of justice that is not linked to that of consensus. A recognition of the heteromorphous nature of language games is a first step in that direction. This obviously implies a renunciation of terror, which assumes that they are isomorphic and tries to make them so. The second step is the principle that any consensus on the rules defining a game and the moves playable within it must be local, in other words, agreed on by its present players and subject to eventual cancellation. The orientation then favors a multiplicity of finite meta-arguments, by which I mean argumentation that concerns meta-prescriptives and is limited in space and time. This orientation corresponds to the course that the evolution of social interaction is currently taking. The temporary contract is in practice supplanting permanent institutions in the professional, emotional, sexual, cultural, family, and international domains, as well as in political affairs. This evolution is, of course, ambiguous. The temporary contract is favored by the system due to its greater flexibility, lower cost, and the creative turmoil of its accompanying motivations. All of these factors contribute to increased operativity. In any case, there's no question here of proposing a pure alternative to the system. We all now know, as the 1970s come to a close, that an attempt at an alternative of that kind would end up resembling the system it was meant to replace. We should be happy that the tendency toward the temporary contract is ambiguous. It is not totally subordinated to the goal of the system, yet the system tolerates it. This bears witness to the existence of another goal within the system, knowledge of language games as such, and the decision to assume responsibility for their rules and effects. Their most significant effect is precisely what validates the adoption of rules, the quest for paralogy. We are finally in a position to understand how the computerization of society affects this problematic. It could become the dream instrument for controlling and regulating the market system, extended to include knowledge itself, and governed exclusively by the performativity principle. In that case, it would inevitably involve the use of terror, but it could also aid groups discussing meta-prescriptives by supplying them with the information they usually lack for making knowledgeable decisions. The line to follow for computerization, to take the second of these two paths, is in principle quite simple. Give the public free access to the memory and data banks. Language games will then be games of perfect information at any given moment. But they would also be non-zero-sum games, and by virtue of that fact, discussion would never risk fixating in a position of minimax equilibrium because it had exhausted its stakes. For the stakes would be knowledge and the reserve of knowledge, language's reserve of possible utterances, is inexhaustible. This sketches the outline of a politics that would respect both the desire for justice and the desire for the unknown,